Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Wednesday, March 12th, 2025, episode 333, and we're going to talk once again about free speech. So, don't mind me. I have a cold. It's going around the school. Everyone is sick, and we just love sharing colds with each other. Anyway, so, episode 32, I talked about how censorship is protection for bad ideas. Just to give you a summary so you don't have to go back and, well, you can go back if you want, just to give you a taste. Um, Censorship is like a national pastime. Everyone does it. Talk about crack babies, alcohol, prohibition, and how a lot of these ideas that basically a lot of people were convinced were either good or a reality, in fact, really wasn't. And that there is a free speech issue when you get down to it. In other words, one side of the argument is pushed and emphasized so you don't hear the other side of the argument, especially when it comes to crack babies. Without free speech, you create an orthodoxy that is the acceptable, correct way of thinking and speaking, and then you have heterodoxy, which is the unacceptable, dangerous, not allowed to say it kind of speech. And the point is that censorship is a clear sign that something is wrong, uh, which is why it's so upsetting that people who are leaning in the right direction, like Trump, perhaps, if we take a very favorable interpretation, and Musk, who's trying to cut down on waste, fraud, and abuse, they're leaning in the right direction, but the administration that group of people is censoring, and it seems in retaliation to the censorship that they experienced before. That is not the way to do it. Censorship is definitely not. It's the signal that your ideas are weak, your ideas are bad, and so therefore you have to prevent other people from being heard. You don't have to do that. My approach was always to emphasize that people can say anything, but you have to take responsibility for the things that you say. So, for example, yelling fire in a crowded theater. Yeah, you can say that, but if anyone gets injured, that's on you. If there's any damage to the property, that's on you, right? The person who yelled fire is now the one who's responsible for damage and for people's lives because you did it as a prank, right? And that, assuming that it wasn't a real fire and people get hurt, you're the one that's going to be held responsible. Take something else like carjacking. Carjacking was all the rage. It was always in the news. I'm not sure if it's still happening, but what was happening is that cars were getting stolen by carjacking rings, right? They were groups of it was an organized crime thing. Cars would be stolen and they would be driven out to the suburbs where they would be stripped, resold, etc. And it was happening so much that people started getting really careful about their cars. And then, at least in this area, when the carjacking was just getting ridiculous, people started shooting the carjackers. And once that happened for a couple of days, and a bunch of carjackers were either shot or shot at, they shifted to robbing fast food stores, right? And so that's the thing. If people have to take responsibility for their choices, in other words, they are not protected, their behavior is not protected, then the consequences will force them to change their behavior. In episode 33, I talked about how good ideas do not require force. And I gave examples of the cell phone, right? No one really needed to be convinced to use a cell phone. So even oh, some people might use a cell phone sparingly, but they'll still use a cell phone, right? And little kids, they want their first smartphone as soon as possible. Then, of course, the airplane, right? You didn't need to convince a whole lot of people that airplane was the future. Maybe in America, there were a lot of skeptical people, but in Europe, it was embraced very, very quickly. uh, DVDs, right? I don't know if anyone still uses DVDs. I have a whole bunch of them downstairs. But DVDs pushed out videotapes, right? And then DVDs eventually were pushed out by streaming, right? And so good ideas, people recognize that they're good ideas, they embrace them, and old technology, old ideas, less better, less good ideas, they fall by the wayside. They're pushed out. And that's okay. You don't need to force people to say this healthcare is better, this system is better. You just allow people to choose. And once you require force, once you use force to get people to do something, then you know that's a signal that it's a bad idea. Episode 78, I talked about how ideas have no color, right? So people try to colorize ideas, like the Enlightenment is a white thing, logic, reason, math is racist, right? So people try to inject color into ideas, ideas that people would like to share, to teach, to speak to other people. So assigning color to ideas or speech ends up with bad discrimination, right? So people are using factors or characteristics of certain ideas which do not exist, which then cause people to make bad choices. Cultural appropriation is an example of a bad idea, right? Oh, you can't steal the ideas of my culture. They were exclusive to my culture. Yeah, that's just kind of weird, right? It's like saying, "Oh, we invented the wheel. The wheel is part of our culture. You're not allowed to use it." You know, that it's kind of like that, right? So, if you don't like people appreciating and admiring and really loving your culture so much to the point where they're going to imitate it, well, we have a problem here, right? So that's supposed to be flattery. It's supposed to be a good thing. And yet we have this movement where, you know, you're not allowed to show your appreciation of another person's culture, right? Because only, you know, people will say the only acceptable interpretation of what's going on is that they're mocking your culture. Okay. So ideas do have baggage, right? The history, consequences of ideas are hard to separate unless the definition and understanding was wrong in the first place, right? So we see this happening all the time. People are using the word fascist, anti-fascist, racist, Nazi, and they're divorced, right? They have been separated from their meaning, but the baggage is what's being, you know, is the point of using those terms, right? But they apply it in ways that have nothing to do with the actual original meaning of those words. So, so the topic is free speech. So what you have to allow is free speech. Now, you as a parent, maybe, or as an older person, you might not like certain kinds of speech, in which case you just move away, change the channel, whatever. Or tell your kids you're not allowed to do this. You know, you put on parental controls, not allowed to listen to this, right? But free speech is a principle of life. We need to have free speech, and free speech is constantly under threat. So even Trump, he's president now. You know, President Trump, you know, it's weird. He knows what it's like to have your speech suppressed. But the problem, of course, is that you feel that you're right. So once you gain power, you basically silence your opponents. That's just straight up hypocrisy. I was listening to Ron Paul's uh, episode that he did recently. In fact, it was today's episode. It was called Flip Flop. Trump restores weapons and intelligence to Ukraine, right? After he said he was going to do that, then now he is. And so I'm beginning to get suspicious. Maybe he's not running 5D chess, uh, you know, but, you know, my brother would always make fun of me. I always look for the silver lining. I'm looking for the hope, hoping that beyond all hope, that maybe he actually has a plan. And now I'm beginning to wonder. At the same time, he talked about Colonel McGregor, Douglas McGregor, and talks about how there are Ukrainian intelligence agents here in the United States threatening and targeting people who are exercising their right of free speech. And so there was a connection made, whether or not it was an act that was the reason, but there was an Alex Jones staffer, a reporter on staff of the Alex Jones podcast, and I talked to my wife and she says, "Oh, you mean that conspiracy theorist, who sometimes get things right, right? Um, Perhaps, but he was murdered in front of his house. He was on that list that the Ukrainian secret police has of people who they needed to have taken out. Daniel McAdams, who co-hosts the podcast with Ron Paul, he's on that list as well because they are reportedly sympathizers with Russia. But that has nothing to do with it. It's about being pro-peace, stop the killing. And clearly, these Ukrainian agents only, uh, favor their side, and whoever opposes them obviously is evil. But again, that's being subjective. You need to have multiple sides. You need to have people making the case on multiple sides so that people will make a decision. And so a lot of people, they want the opposition silence so then people can only hear their side. And so more and more people will agree with them. And that is just simply not a long-term plan. You suppress speech, it explodes, right? Explodes like the pressure builds until it explodes, and then you end up looking bad. Even if your position was the better position, you just look bad, and people make the conclusion that you were suppressing speech because you were wrong, right? But so if you're in the right, you shouldn't have to worry about free speech. And they made an interesting observation that these Ukrainian intelligence units here in the United States operating against American citizens do so with U.S. funding, right? And so we fund these organizations through U.S. NGOs, non-government organizations, right? And so USAID finds an organization, they give them money, and then some of that money comes back to the United States or funds these operations so that they can carry them out. That's where all their money comes from, right? And I made this reference, and I think that's where a lot of Israeli money comes from, AIPAC. I think that a lot of their money comes from these slush funds, right? I mentioned before that, what, $375 billion was in this slush fund controlled by Leon Panetta, who worked for the Clintons. Where's a lot of that money going? Well, it's going to these organizations, and it comes back to the United States, where they fund projects which work against the interests of the United States. So the president and the vice president is on that list of a hit list held by U.S. Ukrainian intelligence agents. And so clearly free speech is under threat. So what does Trump do? He silences speech, he censors speech on campus. Now, you know, whether you agree with them or not, if they are not bothering people, right, in the sense of they're not blocking traffic, they're not harassing students, they're not vandalizing property, then they're exercising their free speech. If they are harassing people, if they are breaking things, if they are vandalizing things, then go after them. But not because of what they said, but because of the damage that they are causing, right? And so you don't need to have these special laws restricting speech, like calling certain things hate speech. Look, hate speech, we all know by now. Hate speech is just basically things that I don't like to hear. Well, if you don't like to hear it, move on down the block, right? And if it's private property, then they can't say it on your property. So put up some sound dampening equipment to so that you don't hear these people any longer. But speech does not harm people physically. The claim is made that they are harmed mentally. Put in some earplugs, right? And that's the thing. And even with my middle schoolers, I realized that a lot of topics come up. To discuss these topics properly, you can't really use certain words. And so basically, to invoke hate speech is just simply the excuse or the way you can ban speech you don't like. And a lot of these arguments, which involve hate speech, it's a lot of emotion, right? There's emotional component in these arguments, like you're hurting the kids. Oh, people are going to starve, without any real statistical backup. But that's what the claim is, right? And when you make a claim, oh, you're going to hurt the kids, right? Then no one really is going to follow up and say, what's the statistics on that, right? And so you're allowed to drop an emotional argument, but in order to counter that argument, you need to produce statistics, right? So it's just a ploy, right? And you know that it's a ploy because it's coming from the same people who want to protect pedophiles, right? So these people who abuse children then turn around and say, oh, no, you're going to hurt kids. We need to keep funding this or that organization. Right. And so this emotional argument, they find an exception and they leverage that exception or they use it and magnify it in order for them to justify the entire program. We talked about this when it came to USAID, right? That maybe there is 5 to 10% or less, maybe or 1 to 10% of USAID that was legitimate. They were really trying to help people. And of course, in order to hide all of the corruption, all of the nefarious activities that you engage in, you need to have a legitimate portion. So when when you come under scrutiny, you hold up that legitimate part, say, look at all the good that we're doing. You can't cancel us, just because we're wasting 90% of all the funding on other things, at least 10% is doing well. You see, then that's how they pretty much do that. It's all manipulation and emotion. It makes me sad that a lot of people that I know knowingly support Nazis in Ukraine. So I thought they were like going to say, oh, there are no Nazis in Ukraine. No, they said, yes, they've always had a Nazi problem. And I'm thinking there like, so you knowingly support Nazis. And it's with the justification that Putin is worse. And then they sit there and say to me, I really don't understand why why you say these things. You are supporting Nazis. You said so yourself. And so this reminds me again of the whole Machiavellian situation where the ends justify the means. Putin is so much worse, so we have to take him out by supporting Nazis. It's just it's insane, right? And these same people are supporting Al Qaeda in Syria. I talked about that yesterday, and they're going after and committing heinous crimes. So those people who yell hate speech and all that kind of stuff, they're perfectly fine with killing, right? With the murder, with all of this destruction and maiming, So I always say, imagine your kids dying because of some warmongering politician, right? You have no idea what's going on. You just know that you are stuck on the front lines to do some killing or be killed, right? And yet it's people like me who get censored, right? So hate speech is really code for I don't like what you're saying. So to defeat all of this, we need logic. We need to recognize that people who flip-flop are not honest, right? And we have the internet, so we have the speeches that people have made, things that people have said years ago, and now they're saying the exact opposite, that a lot of Trump's positions are positions that the Democrats used to push, used to have, like things that Obama used to say, things that Pelosi used to say, things that Bernie Sanders used to say, like let's cut out waste, fraud, and abuse. These are things that they even said. But now that Trump is saying it, now it's bad. Now, they should be called out, right? They should not be allowed to be taken seriously by their constituents without apologies, without explanations, right? Oh, yeah, I said that waste and fraud were really bad back then, but I changed because, right, they need to explain it. And chances are they never do explain it because the reason is because I don't like the guy who's saying it now, right? They came around to my position, but I don't like what they're exposing, and so therefore they're bad. Decoy Voice is a guy I listen to sometimes. I think he said he was Korean, but anyway, so he has an episode. Elon just broke CNN, and he didn't have a lot on Elon Musk, but he was talking about Kevin O'Leary on CNN, talking about what Doge is doing, right? And people are freaking out. But then he also showed in that episode, that episode, podcast episode, YouTube podcast episode, where politicians are flip-flopping, right? Complete 180. Now, I solved everything, right, in my classroom because I didn't have the luxury of being able to dig up all these old videos on the fly. But what I always said was, you can say whatever you want. Anyone can say whatever it is they want. And plus, because it's a college setting, literally they could say anything that they want. But they have to take responsibility for what they say. Like, as I said earlier, you can yell fire in a theater if you want, but can you take the heat? Can you take, no pun intended, can you take the risk of possibly going to prison, of having to pay these heavy fines, which might bankrupt you, right? So are you willing to take responsibility? And chances are people will say no, right? If you're honest about the cost, right? So this is what I want to do, and you are honest about the cost of what it is that you want to do, then you may want to change your mind, right? So what must be sacrificed in order to have this? What must be paid in order to have this? And when you get a clear idea of how much it will cost you, then a lot of people will have to change their mind. Like, we can dream about utopia, but if it requires that you have to die and so you never get to enjoy it, chances are you're not really going to want it, right? So, right. So, and it's like people who want to have solar panels everywhere, right? So, are you willing to pay for it yourself? And the answer is always no. People who want to raise minimum wage, people who want to raise the pay of the workers where they're shopping, yeah, if they have to pay, if raising their wages means that what you pay for your products is going to go up, then they don't want to pay, right? And it's this idea of socialism where they spread out the cost, where they believe they can advocate for the so-called good thing, the right thing, and it doesn't affect them. But as soon as it does, they change their mind. And so a lot of knowledge producers, a lot of people in society, teachers, they try to make sure to divorce or separate the cost of the choice with the choice itself, right? And if you don't want to pay, that is the incentive, the motivation to find something better, right? And that is the heart of innovation and creativity. I've said this many times before, but that's how you always get to innovation and creativity. You don't like the way things are, then come up with something better. If you can't find someone else who's doing something better, who's offering something different and better, well, then it's up to you to figure out something better. And yes, it means that you got to do research. It means you got to study. It means you got to become knowledgeable. And that's exactly what we need in this society, right? People using their heads, thinking deeply, thinking and understanding the source of the problem, and therefore figuring out how to truly solve the problem, right? But people don't do this. They would rather you suffer so they can be the hero and society gets worse, right? And this is why free speech is so important. We need to have that competition of ideas, freely spoken and freely rejected or accepted, especially if it is a better idea. That's it for today. I'll talk to you next time.